Mister? The voice was so small it barely reached above the sound of the fountain. Ethan Parker didn't look up from his phone. He was sitting on the stone steps of the East Terrace, the only outdoor space in his 40-room Maplewood estate where he could steal 10 minutes away from his assistant, his board members, and the relentless noise of being worth $4 billion. His jacket was folded beside him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. For once, he looked almost human. Mister, I need to talk to you. He looked up then because the voice didn't waver. It didn't carry the nervous tremor of an employee tiptoeing around his moods or the overly polished tone of someone trying to impress him. It was just direct, unapologetically, fearlessly direct. Standing 3 feet away from him, holding a small pink bicycle with one hand and a crumpled dollar bill with the other, was a toddler. She couldn't have been older than 3. She had dark curly pigtails with yellow ribbon bows, a strawberry print dress with a grass stain on the hem, and the most serious brown eyes Ethan Parker had ever seen on a human being. He stared at her. She stared back. My bicycle is broken, she announced. The wheel is wobbly. See. She tilted it toward him as evidence, and sure enough, the front wheel listed to the left at a sorry angle. I tried to fix it myself, but my hands are too small. Ethan blinked. Where's your mother? Inside, cleaning the big mirror in the hallway. She said don't bother nobody. The little girl tilted her head, unbothered. But you're not nobody. You're the man who lives here. Mama says you own the whole house. I do. Then you probably know how to fix things in it. She stepped forward and held out the crumpled dollar bill with great ceremony. I'll give you $1 if you fix my bicycle. It's all I have, but it's a lot. Something moved in Ethan's chest. It was unfamiliar enough that he almost didn't recognize it. What's your name? He asked. Clara. She said it like it was the most important name in the world, which in that moment it was. Clara Rose Simmons. What's your name?
Ethan.
She considered this. That's a good name. Do you know how to fix bicycles, Ethan? He owned 3 manufacturing companies, 2 tech firms, and a logistics empire that spanned 11 countries. He had not fixed anything with his hands in approximately 20 years. He looked at the wobbly pink bicycle with its plastic flower stickers and its white basket with a fake daisy on the front. Let me see it, he said. Clara beamed like he'd just promised her the moon. She walked right up to him and set the bicycle down at his feet with the confidence of someone conducting a formal business transaction. Ethan crouched down, his expensive trousers be damned, and examined the front wheel. The bolt on the axle had simply come loose. A basic fix, 5 minutes at most if he had the right tool. I need a wrench, he said. What's a wrench?
A tool.
For tightening bolts. Clara nodded very seriously, as though filing this information away. I don't have a wrench, but there's a toolbox in the garden shed. Rodrigo showed me. Rodrigo is the gardener. He has a nice mustache. Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. The garden shed. I can show you where it is. She reached out and took his hand.
Just like that.
No hesitation. No asking permission. She simply wrapped her small fingers around 2 of his and started walking, pulling the man who made CEOs sweat through boardrooms as though he were a reluctant golden retriever. Ethan Parker let himself be led. The shed was at the far end of the garden, half hidden behind a row of rose bushes his landscape team kept immaculate. Clara pushed the door open and pointed at the red toolbox on the shelf with the authority of someone who had done extensive prior research. Ethan found a small wrench, and they walked back to the terrace together, Clara chattering the entire way. I have $14.33 in my piggy bank, she told him. I'm saving for a kite. Mama said, maybe for my birthday. My birthday is in November. That's far away. She paused. Do you have a birthday? Everyone has a birthday. When's yours? March. That's soon. She gasped like this was extraordinary news. Are you gonna have a party?
No.
Clara frowned at this, deeply troubled. Everybody should have a party on their birthday. Even grown-ups. Maybe especially grown-ups, because grown-ups seem sad a lot. Ethan said nothing. He crouched down again and began tightening the axle bolt on the front wheel, turning the wrench in slow, careful rotations. The wheel straightened. He tested it, spun it with his hand, smooth and true. There, he said. It's fixed. Clara dropped to her knees on the stone and spun the wheel herself, watching it turn with pure, unbridled delight. Then she looked up at him with those big brown eyes overflowing with something so warm and genuine it almost physically hurt to look at directly. You fixed it. You're so good at fixing things. He stood up, dusted his hands on his trousers without caring about the smudge. Clara solemnly held out the crumpled dollar bill. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. $1. She was offering him $1. A little girl in a strawberry dress who was saving for a kite and thought grown-ups deserved birthday parties. Keep it, he said quietly, for the kite fund. Clara stared at him. Then her whole face crumpled, not in sadness, but in the overwhelmed way of a child experiencing a kindness too big to contain. She stood up, reached forward, and hugged him around the knees, because that was as high as she could reach, pressing her small face into his leg with her arms wrapped tight. Ethan Parker stood very still. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him. He genuinely could not locate the memory. You're really nice, Clara whispered into his knee. Even though everybody acts scared of you. He stood there in the afternoon sun, a $4 billion man undone by a toddler and a pink bicycle, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Like maybe the world wasn't entirely made of boardrooms and cold marble floors. Like maybe there was still something warm left in it, after all. The bicycle riding lasted exactly 11 minutes before disaster struck again. Not a mechanical disaster this time. Clara was pedaling with tremendous enthusiasm along the garden path, her yellow ribbons flying, her face alight with the specific joy of a child who has just had something broken made whole again, when she hit a small divot in the stone path, overcorrected, and went sideways into the rose bushes. Ethan was on his feet before he registered moving. He crossed the garden in 5 long strides and found her sitting up in the dirt beside the bush, her bicycle on its side, a small scratch on her forearm from a thorn, her face frozen in that brief, suspended moment between the fall and the decision about whether or not to cry. She looked at her arm. She looked at him. Her lower lip quivered. It's just a scratch, he said, crouching in front of her. Small. Already stopping. Clara looked at her arm again, processing this assessment. Then she looked at the scratch with a dignity that he suspected she'd learned from watching her mother handle hard things without falling apart. Does it need a bandage? She asked. Probably a good idea. Mama has bandages in her bag. The ones with the little stars on them. Clara looked at the rose bush with narrowed eyes, as though personally betrayed by it. That bush jumped out at me. Bushes do that sometimes. They shouldn't. She stood up, brushed the dirt off her dress with both hands, and then looked at him with a question already forming in her eyes. Will you carry me inside? And there it was again, that guileless, uncomplicated request. No manipulation, no performance. Just a 3-year-old who'd fallen down and wanted to be carried, asking the nearest adult with the same simplicity she might ask for a glass of water. Ethan Parker was not a man who carried children. He was not, in any practical or personal sense, a man who interacted with children at all. His world was conference rooms and contracts and carefully maintained emotional distance. He picked her up. She settled against his side with the easy comfort of a child who trusted entirely, resting her head on his shoulder like it was a familiar place. She smelled like sunscreen and something sweet, juice, maybe, or those little fruit snacks children carried everywhere. Her arm wrapped loosely around his neck. They walked toward the house in silence for a moment. "You're strong," Clara observed. "Like a daddy." The word landed with a weight that had nothing to do with its syllables. "Your mama carries you a lot?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully level. "Mama carries me when I'm tired, and when I'm scared, and when we walk far." Clara considered this. But sometimes she gets really tired too. She works a lot.
A pause.
"I don't have a daddy." Ethan said nothing. He kept walking. "Some kids at the park have daddies," Clara continued, in the thoughtful tone of a small philosopher working through a complex problem. "Lily has a daddy who pushes her on the swings really high. And Marcus has a daddy who knows how to do cartwheels."
She paused again.
"Do you know how to do cartwheels?" "No." "That's okay. You know how to fix bicycles." "That's better." She patted his shoulder consolingly. He pushed open the side door and found Sophie Simmons in the main hallway, just coming around the corner with her cleaning caddy, her dark hair pulled back, her expression already shifting from focused to alarmed the moment she saw her daughter in the arms of her employer. "Clara." Sophie's voice came out higher than she intended. "Oh, Mr. Parker, I'm so sorry. I told her not to bother anyone. She was supposed to stay by the fountain." "She fell off the bicycle," Ethan said. "Rosebush. Small scratch. She needs the star bandages, apparently." Sophie blinked. She looked at her daughter, settled serenely against Ethan Parker's shoulder, and then at Ethan Parker himself, who was standing in her employer's hallway holding her child with the careful, slightly uncertain posture of a man who didn't quite know what to do with what he was holding but wasn't going to drop it. "I'll take her," Sophie said, setting down the caddy and reaching out. Clara transferred to her mother with a small sigh, and Sophie pressed her lips to the scratch on her daughter's arm in the automatic, reflexive way of mothers everywhere. "Mama, Ethan fixed my bicycle," Clara said importantly. "And he carried me. He's really strong." "I see that," Sophie said quietly. She looked at Ethan over Clara's curls. "Thank you. Truly. I'm sorry she bothered you." "She didn't bother me." It came out more plainly than he intended. No qualifier, no polite deflection, just the direct, unvarnished truth, which surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Sophie Simmons had worked in this house for 4 months, and in that time, Ethan Parker had said approximately 300 words to her. They were all professional. None of them had carried any warmth. She was good at her job, quiet, efficient, and she had a 3-year-old daughter named Clara who had apparently just spent an hour in his garden without him minding in the least. Sophie studied his face for a moment, searching for the social script she was supposed to follow. "She wanted to show me her bicycle repair," Ethan added. He was already stepping back, the unfamiliar territory of warmth making him retreat on instinct, reclaiming the distance that felt safer. "The star bandages," he said again, nodding toward Clara's arm, because it was easier than figuring out what else to say. He walked back to the terrace. He sat back down. He picked up his phone. He didn't read a single word on the screen for a very long time. In his mind, Clara's voice replayed, with the gentle persistence of water finding its way through stone.
"I don't have a daddy."
"Some kids at the park have daddies." "You're strong."
"Like a daddy."
He had grown up in a house full of staff and empty of parents. His father had been a figure of distant authority who communicated primarily through expectation. His mother had left when he was 6, and no one had ever adequately explained why, in a way a child could hold on to. He had learned early and well that the safest thing was to need no one. He had built an empire on that lesson. He had also been alone in every room of every house he had ever owned. He sat in the afternoon sun and thought about a little girl who offered everything she had, one crumpled dollar because she believed simply and completely, that adults could be kind. He thought about how she'd reached for his hand without asking. He thought about how she'd hugged his knee and said "you're really nice" like it was something she'd discovered. He thought about the bicycle track in the East Garden, the long smooth section near the fountain where the path curved wide and level, where a small girl could ride without hitting divots or rose bushes.
His phone buzzed.
17 messages. 3 missed calls from the Sydney office. A contract amendment that needed his signature. Ethan Parker, for possibly the first time in his professional adult life, left all of it unread. He sat in the garden until the sun began to lower, listening to the distant sound of Clara's laughter drifting from somewhere inside the mansion, bright and unbothered, like a small bell ringing in a very quiet room. Night came early to the Parker estate in October. By 7 in the evening, the grounds were wrapped in a blue-gray dusk that turned the fountain to silver and made the oak trees along the north fence look like something from an illustration in a book of old stories. Most of the staff had finished their shifts and gone home. The kitchen was quiet. The long hallways that Ethan walked every night, because he rarely slept before 1 in the morning and walking was preferable to sitting still with his thoughts, were dim and cool and entirely empty. He liked it this way. He had always told himself he liked it this way. He passed the door to the staff quarters wing, a small but comfortable suite of rooms at the back of the house, one of which Sophie Simmons rented at reduced cost as part of her employment arrangement. Standard practice for live-in housekeeping staff. Practical. Efficient. Nothing more. The light under the door was still on. He didn't slow down. He kept walking, hands in the pockets of his dark sweater, moving through the familiar geography of his own house like a man navigating a museum after hours.
But he heard something.
A voice. Small, gentle, rising and falling in the particular rhythm of a bedtime story. Not the words, just the music of it. Sophie reading to Clara. He caught a single sentence through the door as he passed. And the bear found his way home through the dark forest, because he remembered the light was always waiting for him. Ethan stopped walking. He stood in the hallway for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to feel ridiculous about it. Then he kept moving. But the sentence followed him. The light was always waiting for him. He made his way to his study, the real one, the private one on the 2nd floor, not the formal office where he held meetings. This room had books he had actually read, a fireplace he actually used, and a desk that held the only photograph he'd kept from his childhood, himself at approximately 8 years old, standing in front of a lake in Maine, holding up a fish he'd caught with a hired guide because his father was too busy to come. He was smiling in the photo. He remembered that the smile had taken effort, because the day had been lonely and he'd wanted very much for someone to be proud of him, and there had been no one there to receive the feeling. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. Not to answer emails. He found himself, almost without deciding to, looking up bicycle tracks, garden paths, child-safe outdoor play areas. He clicked through images of smooth, winding paths with gentle curves, low wooden borders painted in cheerful colors, small ramps no higher than a few inches. He thought about the East Garden. He knew it well. It was the largest open section of the grounds, the place where the stone pathways widened and the terrain was flattest, where in the summer his landscape team maintained a stretch of fine gravel paths circling the old oak. With the right equipment, a smooth track could be laid along that path in a matter of hours. It was an absurd idea. He told himself it was an absurd idea 4 separate times, which meant, in his experience, that he had already decided to do it. He called Marcus, his facilities manager, at 8:15 p.m. Marcus answered on the 2nd ring, because Marcus had been working for Ethan for 6 years and had learned that the man did not make non-urgent calls. "I need the East Garden path cleared and resurfaced with smooth paving," Ethan said without preamble. 6 feet wide minimum. The full loop around the oak. "I also need wooden track borders, low, around 6 inches, and a small ramp section, no more than 4 inches at the peak. Safe for a child's bicycle. He paused. Can this be completed by morning? A beat of silence from Marcus. A very professional beat of silence, to his credit. I'll have the crew out by 9 tonight, Mr. Parker. We can do a resin-bound surface over the existing gravel. It'll be smooth and set within a few hours. Track borders and the ramp I can source tonight. I know a supplier. Good. And Marcus. He hesitated, which was unlike him. Quietly. Don't make an announcement of it to the general staff. Of course, sir. He hung up. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his study, where a crack in the plaster had been running diagonally since last winter, and he'd never bothered to have it repaired because it was his private room and there was no one in it to perform order for. He was building a bicycle track. At 9 o'clock at night, because a 3-year-old girl had offered him $1 and told him he was nice and held his hand without asking. There was a word for what he was doing. Several words, probably. He opened a different file on his laptop, one he'd been meaning to review all week, the Q4 projections from his Shanghai division. He stared at the spreadsheet. The numbers made complete sense to the part of his brain that lived in those columns, and 0 sense to the part that kept hearing "you're really nice," even though everybody acts scared of you. His phone lit up. A message from his assistant, Daniel. Sydney contract waiting on your signature. Milan wants to confirm Thursday's call. Also, happy to remind you that you have the Hamilton Foundation Gala next Friday, and you told me to remind you that you were planning to cancel it. He replied to the first 2 items. On the gala, he typed, cancel it. Then he sat for a moment, phone in hand, and thought about what Clara had said about birthdays. Everybody should have a party. Even grown-ups. Maybe especially grown-ups, because grown-ups seem sad a lot. He didn't go to galas for the same reason. He didn't stay in rooms where people expected warmth from him. He was always in those spaces, performing a version of ease he didn't possess, smiling at the right moments, shaking hands with the right pressure, saying the precise amount of nothing that read as something. He was very good at it. It exhausted him completely. Clara had not required any of that. She had met him exactly where he was, sitting on stone steps, rolled sleeves, unguarded, and simply handed him her broken thing and assumed, with no evidence and complete confidence, that he would help. He heard, distantly, the sound of machinery starting up in the east garden. He went to the window. Through the dark, he could see the lights Marcus's crew had set up, portable work lamps casting golden circles on the gravel path, 2 men in work jackets moving with efficient purpose. By morning, that path would be smooth and wide and bordered. By morning, there would be a ramp in the old oak shadow, just the right height for a 3-year-old learning to feel brave. Ethan stood at the window for a long time, watching the men work, his hands loose at his sides, the Shanghai spreadsheet forgotten behind him. The cold and enormous house was quiet. But for the first time in longer than he could precisely calculate, the quiet felt like it might eventually have room in it for something else. Sophie Simmons heard it first. She was up early, as always, 5:55, alarm turned off before it could sound, habit from years of early shifts, and a toddler who woke with the sun and required a 10-minute head start to become a functional adult. She was in the small kitchen of their quarters, coffee maker running, still in her robe, mentally sorting through the morning's cleaning schedule when she heard the sound from outside. She went to the window. For a moment she thought she was imagining it. The east garden was different. She could see it clearly from here. The wide curved path around the old oak, which she had walked past 100 times and knew to be gravel-surfaced and somewhat uneven, was now a smooth, pale gray loop, 6 feet across, bordered on both sides by low wooden rails painted white, with a small gentle ramp near the far curve that caught the early light and made a soft arch. It had not been there yesterday. Sophie stood at the window with her coffee mug held halfway to her mouth, processing this. Behind her, the bedroom door opened and Clara came out, still in her pajamas, hair wild, clutching the small stuffed rabbit she called Biscuit, dragging the bicycle by its handlebar. "Mama, I'm going to ride my bicycle," Clara announced. "Clara, it's barely 6 in the morning. The bicycle wants to go outside." "The bicycle can wait until..." "Mama." Clara pointed urgently toward the window, because she had spotted it too, being at an age where her eyes moved faster than her comprehension. "Mama, there's a track." Sophie set down her coffee. They went outside together, Clara in her pajamas and rubber boots, Sophie still in her robe, and stood at the edge of the East Garden in the early October morning, breath misting in the cool air, staring at a thing that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. It was beautiful, in the simple way that intentional things are beautiful. The smooth path curved in a wide, gentle loop, perfectly scaled. The wooden rails were sanded smooth. The ramp was exactly the right height, enough to be thrilling to a small child, low enough to be safe. Beside the ramp, tucked against the border rail, was a small wooden box with a lid, painted the same white as the borders. Clara ran to it immediately and opened it. Inside, a small bicycle helmet, pink, with yellow stars, Clara's exact size. A note was folded on top of it, written in careful block letters. For the official bicycle track, riders must wear their helmet. Clara stared at the helmet. She put it on her head. It fit perfectly. She turned around and looked at her mother with an expression Sophie would keep with her for the rest of her life. Pure, uncomplicated wonder. The face of a child who has encountered a kindness too large to fully understand, but feels it completely in every part of herself. "Ethan did this," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Sophie looked at the house. At the upper windows where the study lights were still on, where she suspected a man who didn't sleep had spent the night watching workers build something he would never admit meant anything. "I think so," she said softly. "I knew he was nice," Clara announced to the garden and the oak tree and the pink morning sky, with the complete and satisfied confidence of someone whose hypothesis has been conclusively proven. Then she climbed on her bicycle and she rode. Sophie stood in her robe in the cool morning air and watched her daughter ride. Around the curve, past the oak, up the little ramp with a gasp of delight, down the other side, laughing, laughing, the sound of it opening upward into the October sky like something winged and free. She didn't notice Ethan until he'd been standing at the terrace door for a full minute. He was in the same dark sweater from the night before, a mug of coffee in his hand, clearly not having slept, leaning against the door frame with the posture of someone who had come outside for reasons they weren't fully prepared to examine. His eyes were on Clara. His expression was doing something complicated and unguarded that Sophie suspected he would have shut down immediately if he'd known anyone was watching. She watched him watch her daughter. She saw the exact moment Clara noticed him, the little girl's trajectory shifting, steering the bicycle directly toward the terrace with unnerving precision, braking in front of him in a spray of momentum. "Ethan." Clara was breathless, incandescent, her helmet slightly askew, her cheeks flushed. "Did you make the track?" A pause. Just a breath of hesitation. "Marcus and his crew made it," he said. "But you told them to?" Another pause. Clara stared at him with those unblinking brown eyes, and Ethan Parker discovered what so many had discovered before him. There was no effective defense against a toddler asking a direct question. "Yes," he said. Clara got off her bicycle. She walked up to him. She tugged his sleeve until he crouched down to her level. Then she put her small hands on either side of his face, the way children do when they want to make absolutely certain they have your full attention, and she looked at him very seriously for a moment.
Thank you, she said.
This is the best thing. And she kissed his cheek. Once, quick, matter of fact, the way she kissed her mother's cheek when she meant it most. Then she ran back to her bicycle, climbed on, and rode. Ethan stayed crouching for a moment after she left. Then he straightened, and he stood very still, and Sophie, watching from across the garden, saw him press 2 fingers briefly to the cheek where Clara had kissed him, like a man checking whether something was real. She looked away before he could see that she'd seen. She walked toward the terrace. He heard her and turned, and they were both in the position of pretending neither of them had just witnessed something private and irreversible.
Good morning, she said.
Good morning. They stood side by side in the cool air, watching Clara ride, and for the length of 3 full loops around the oak, neither of them said a single word, and it was somehow the most comfortable silence Sophie had shared with another adult in a very long time. It was almost 8 when Clara finally came inside, cheeks pink, arms tired, declaring that the bicycle needed a rest, and so did she, and could she have the crackers with the peanut butter, please, not the plain ones. Sophie went to get breakfast together. Ethan, she assumed, would return to his study and his spreadsheets and the efficient fortress of his working day. He did not. He was still on the terrace when she came back out 10 minutes later to retrieve the small blanket Clara had left on the stone steps. He had sat back down in his original spot, the same place Clara had found him yesterday, and he was not looking at his phone. I owe you an apology, Sophie said. He looked up. For what? For Clara. She picked up the blanket, folded it over her arm. She doesn't always obey the stay near the fountain rule. She finds a target and she commits. A pause. She's been talking about wanting a daddy lately. She's at that age where she notices what other children have. I'm sorry if she said something that made you uncomfortable. Ethan was quiet for a moment. She said you work very hard. Sophie blinked. She said that you carry her when she's tired and scared. That you work a lot. He looked at the garden. She said it without complaint, like it was just a true thing about the world.
A beat.
She's not wrong. Sophie felt something tighten briefly in her throat. She's generous, she said carefully. More than she has reason to be. Her father, he stopped. I'm sorry. That's not my business. It's fine. Sophie sat down on the lower step, because her legs had been moving since 5:30 and the morning was still cold, and the step was there. He left when she was 4 months old. It wasn't dramatic, no fight, no betrayal. He just decided fatherhood wasn't something he wanted, and he went. She looked at her hands. The hard part isn't the past. The hard part is watching her look for it in other people. She glanced up at him briefly. She looked for it in you. I hope that wasn't. It wasn't a burden, Ethan said. His voice was quiet and very certain. Sophie studied him. In 4 months, she had cataloged him the way employees catalog the people they work for, his schedule, his moods, his preferences, the way he took his coffee, the way he moved through the house like someone who owned every room but didn't belong in any of them. She had not, until this moment, seen what was underneath the catalog. Can I ask you something? She said. He nodded once. The track. The helmet. The note. She paused.
Why?
Ethan looked at the east garden for a long moment. The morning light was full on it now, making the smooth path almost luminous, the white borders clean and bright. From inside, faintly, they could hear Clara singing to herself over her crackers and peanut butter, some song she'd invented, as she often did. I grew up in a house the size of this one, he said. Or close to it. My father bought it to impress people, the way he bought everything. He paused. There was a garden, bigger than this. I wasn't allowed to run in it. It was for appearance. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. I had a bicycle. I rode it in the driveway. Alone mostly. There was no track. No one who thought to build one. He was quiet for a moment. Clara asked me yesterday if I was having a birthday party in March. I told her no. She told me everyone deserves a party, especially grown-ups, because grown-ups seem sad a lot. Sophie was very still. She's 3 years old, Ethan said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite wonder and wasn't quite pain. And she noticed something it took me 38 years to even allow myself to look at. The silence between them was a different quality now. Less polite distance, more shared ground. She's always been like that, Sophie said softly. Even as a baby, she looked at people like she was trying to find the good thing in them. A small, helpless smile. It makes the world very hard sometimes, and very beautiful sometimes. She found me fixing something, Ethan said. She just assumed I could help. She didn't consider that I might not. He shook his head. I've been in rooms full of people who needed things from me for my entire career. No one has ever just handed me something broken and trusted me with it that directly. Sophie thought about that. She thought about her daughter walking up to one of the most intimidating men in the country with a pink bicycle and a crumpled dollar and not a shred of doubt in her small body. She trusts like breathing, Sophie said. She doesn't think about it. She just does it.
I don't know how to do that, he said.
It was the most honest sentence he had spoken to another person perhaps in years. He seemed to know it too. He looked briefly startled by his own words. Sophie didn't rush to fill the space with reassurance. She let it sit, the way you let a real thing sit when you respect it. Neither do I, she said finally. Most adults don't. She stood up, blanket still over her arm. But Clara keeps demonstrating it. I figure if I watch her closely enough, I'll learn. She went back inside. Ethan sat on the step with his cold coffee, and the morning around him was very quiet, and in the kitchen, Clara sang her invented song, and the white borders of the bicycle track caught the light, and the old oak stood over all of it, broad and unhurried. The way old things stand over the small, important moments that humans barely notice are changing them. He noticed. Section 6. What gets fixed when you stop being afraid? November arrived with the particular kindness of a year deciding, at the last moment, to be gentle. The mornings were gold and cold. The oak had turned fully, its leaves coming down in slow, unhurried spirals, gathering at the borders of the bicycle track in loose amber drifts that Clara rode through every morning before school, deliberately, for the sound they made under her wheels. She had learned, in the weeks since the track appeared, to navigate the ramp without holding her breath. She had learned to steer with one hand. She had learned, after one minor tumble, that the helmet rule was good and right, and Ethan had been correct about everything. Ethan had become a fixture at the terrace door. Not every morning. Not ostentatiously. He simply appeared, sometimes, coffee in hand, sleeves rolled, watching the loop, watching Clara, occasionally calling out a quiet observation, weight forward on the ramp or a good line through the curve, things he'd looked up, Sophie suspected, at some hour of the night when he couldn't sleep and had decided to become competent at something new. Clara always saw him. She always waved with both arms, both hands, the full-body enthusiasm of a child who has decided someone matters. He always waved back. One hand, small, but real. Sophie watched all of this the way you watch a difficult thing slowly, carefully mend, aware that naming it too directly might startle it back apart. Then came the morning of Clara's birthday, November 15th. She turned 4 in the blue-gray early morning, opening her eyes in her small bed and announcing the fact immediately to Biscuit the rabbit, to the ceiling, and then to Sophie, who was already in the kitchen making the birthday pancakes with the blueberries shaped into the number 4, who had stayed up past midnight to finish the small decorated cake that now sat on the counter under a cloth. "I'm 4, Clara said, coming into the kitchen with the solemnity of one who has crossed a significant threshold. "I am a big kid now." "You are," Sophie agreed. "I need to tell Ethan." Sophie set down the spatula. "Clara, he should know it's my birthday." Clara was already heading for the back door with the certainty of someone executing a long-laid plan. "You said everybody deserves a party. I'm going to make sure he knows." She found him, as she usually did, on the terrace, except this morning he was already there before she arrived, which was unusual. He was standing rather than sitting, hands in his pockets, and there was something set up behind him that Clara didn't notice immediately because she ran straight at him and grabbed his hand and announced, "It's my birthday. I am 4. "I know," he said. She blinked. "How do you know?" "Your mother mentioned it." He turned slightly and gestured behind him. Clara looked. On the terrace table, a birthday cake, bakery made, frosted in pink and yellow, with 4 candles and Clara written across the top in yellow icing. Beside it, a box wrapped in yellow paper with a bow and a card. And at the edge of the terrace, a new kite, a proper one, large and beautiful, blue and yellow, with a long ribbon tail, rolled and waiting. The kite fund. He had remembered. Clara looked at the kite. She looked at the cake. She looked at Ethan Parker, who was watching her with the expression Sophie had started to recognize as his version of open, carefully open. Like a door, he was holding a jar that he hadn't learned yet to leave wide. "You made me a party," Clara said, very quietly, the way children speak when something is large. "Small one," he said. "Just us." Clara nodded, taking this in. Just us. Her mother appeared at the terrace door behind her, having followed without interfering, standing now in the doorway, hand pressed quietly to her mouth. "Ethan," Clara said. "Yes. You know what I want for my birthday?" "I thought the kite." "The kite is good," she said seriously. "But what I want is..." She looked up at him, her 4-year-old face entirely earnest and entirely undefended. "I want you to have a party in March. A real one. With cake and everything." She pointed at him. "You said you don't have parties. That's not okay." I decided. For a moment the terrace was completely still. Ethan crouched down to her level. His expression was doing the complicated thing again. The thing that Sophie had learned meant he was feeling something he hadn't prepared for and wasn't going to look away from. "I'll think about it," he said. Clara narrowed her eyes. "That means yes and grown-up?" Despite himself, despite every careful, defended thing in him, he smiled. Not the managed professional version. A real one. Small and a little unpracticed, but real. "Yes," he said. "It means yes." Clara put her arms around his neck and hugged him, and this time he didn't stay still. He wrapped both arms around her small back and held on, and Sophie watched her daughter be held by a man who had not let himself hold anything in longer than he could remember, and felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with beginning. They lit the candles. Clara blew them out in one breath, cheeks puffed, dead serious about it. Sophie cut the cake. Ethan handed plates around, slightly awkward, like someone relearning a domestic gesture. They ate birthday cake on the terrace in the November morning. Clara got frosting on her nose. Ethan, without ceremony, reached over and wiped it away with his napkin. Clara laughed. Sophie laughed. Ethan made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was its neighbor, warm, involuntary, arriving before he could manage it. Later, they flew the kite. The wind was just right, steady and cooperative, the kind of November wind that seems to know it's needed. Clara held the spool and Ethan held it steady, and Sophie stood back and watched the blue and yellow kite rise into the pale sky above the old oak, its ribbon tail streaming behind it, and Clara's head tipped back and her mouth open in a shout of pure joy. It's going. It's really going. And Ethan Parker, who had spent 38 years building walls taller than his own capacity to climb, looked up at the kite and felt the cord in his hands and heard the small girl beside him shouting at the sky, and something in him that had been broken for a very long time, longer than any bicycle, longer than any easy fix, shifted into place with a quietness that felt, somehow, like the most important sound he had ever heard. Sophie met his eyes over Clara's head. She smiled, not carefully, not with the measured warmth of an employee, but the full, unguarded smile of someone who has watched a difficult thing become beautiful. He looked away first, because it was a lot. It was, honestly, a staggering amount of something he had known was still possible. But he looked back, and the kite flew on. That evening, after Clara had been put to bed with Biscuit the rabbit, and the memory of the kite flying replayed at length until sleep finally claimed her mid-sentence, Sophie sat alone in the small kitchen, the birthday cake covered in plastic wrap, the ribbon from the kite box on the table. She heard a knock.
Light.
Uncertain. She opened the door. Ethan stood in the hallway. "I wanted to say," he started, and then stopped, in the way of someone who prepared words that aren't quite reaching him. "Today was," he paused. "I'm not accustomed to this." "I know," she said gently. "She's extraordinary," he said. "Your daughter." He looked at a point just past Sophie's shoulder, because looking directly at the thing was still hard. "You've given her something remarkable. That trust she has. That openness." Sophie thought about it. "I think she was just born that way," she said. "She came into the world expecting to be met with kindness. I've mostly tried not to ruin it." "You haven't," he said. "Not remotely." The hallway was quiet between them. The mansion was enormous and still around that small lit doorway. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said. "Okay." The track and this morning, and he exhaled. "I want to be here. If that's something you'd allow. For Clara. With you." He met her eyes then, direct and careful. "Not out of loneliness."
"I want to be clear about that."
"Not because I need filling, but because," he stopped. "Then, she offered me $1 and assumed I could help. And I want to be someone who can, reliably, for a long time." Sophie looked at him for a moment. A cold and careful man who built a bicycle track in the middle of the night, who remembered a kite fund, who learned how to coach ramp technique at 2 a.m., who waved back with one hand, small but real, every single morning. "I'd allow it," she said. He nodded once. He almost said something else, and then didn't, and the unsaid thing sat between them like a promissory note neither of them needed to cash immediately. He said goodnight. He walked back down the hallway. Sophie closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, the birthday ribbon bright on the table, the cake covered in plastic wrap, the kite rolled and waiting in the corner for the next good wind. In her room, Clara was already dreaming. She could hear the small, even breath of her through the wall, deep and untroubled, the sleep of a child who had spent her birthday doing exactly what she had planned, eating cake and flying kites and making sure that someone she loved knew they deserved a party. Mission accomplished. Ethan Parker walked the long hallway back to his study.
He sat at his desk.
He opened his laptop. He found the calendar, his carefully managed, back-to-back calendar, every March block filled with meetings and calls and the efficient machinery of his working life. He scrolled to March 15th. He typed, birthday.
Party. Cake.
He stared at it for a moment. Then he left it there and went to bed, and for the first time in many years, slept without difficulty, because somewhere in the same house, A 4-year-old girl with yellow ribbons in her hair was dreaming of kites, and the light was on, and someone, finally, had been waiting. The end.